Good morning, everyone. I'm Chris Parker. This is Chris Nishihara. We're with the Ishihara and Parker Law Firm here in Longview, Texas. And today we're covering a topic that catches a lot of people by surprise. We're looking at a situation where you are married and your loved one, your spouse, is needing long-term care. Sometimes that's something that's gradual and you see it coming, and other times it's a surprise, medical event, something happens. So where are we going with this one, Kristen?
Yeah, so, a lot of times, obviously it's not a desirable situation, but sometimes there's just no way to physically provide care for a spouse at home at some point. So a lot of times we have clients that come in that their loved one has had a medical event and they're at the hospital and now they're getting discharged to a rehab facility, which is usually the same thing as a skilled nursing facility. And then Medicare will pay for 20 days there. If they have a supplemental policy, they may get another 80 days of rehab. But then the family is faced with a situation, which is, is our loved one well enough to come home, and are we able to provide the medical care needed there? A lot of times the answer is really no. And so we want to step in and help be a resource so that families understand they can get the medical care that their loved one needs. Sometimes and often, if you're a married couple, Medicaid, it would be available to help pay for the skilled nursing facility. So we just want to alleviate some of the myths surrounding that. Because if my husband were needing to be at a skilled nursing facility and stay long term, I'm immediately worried about, well, where's his income going to go? How am I going to pay my bills? How am I going to pay for what our household needs? Because I'm still living at home, and I'm going to need a certain amount of income, and I don't want to have to spend down all of our assets. I don't want to lose my house. So in addition to the very serious medical situation you're dealing with, now there's a whole bunch of financial concerns. So that's where we can really step in and help, I think.
We see people all the time who either are in that situation where their days are running out at the nursing home, skilled nursing, and they're already saying, hey, I'm bringing my loved one home regardless of the safety of doing so, regardless of the risk to the spouse at home of, helping and transitioning and breaking their own hip and falling. Or we have someone at home who's been staying at home long past the point of safety because the family is always concerned about these costs. They just assume, hey, we own things, we've worked all of our lives, we have assets, we have income, and therefore we know that we're on our own. And that's not true. We've talked to people all the time and say, listen, of course the priority is bring them home if possible, that loved one home. But if you can't do that safely, there are some very favorable rules. So when we're talking about Texas Medicaid, some of the rules are same for everybody. Is your loved one a U.S. citizen? Are they a Texas resident? Do they have a medical necessity, which at this point they have a medical necessity. So really where it gets down to it is the look at income. So tell us, Kristen, how does Texas Medicaid consider income with a married couple?
Yeah, so if, the situation that we're going to address today is, let's say, husband needs skilled nursing, wife is going to stay in the community. She's what we call a community spouse, and so the state of Texas acknowledges that a spouse in the community needs a certain amount of income. So when we're talking about income, we're talking about Social Security for sure. We're talking about any pensions that you routinely get every month. We're talking about any annuities that provide you a structured amount every month. We're talking about anything that comes in monthly on a consistent basis, so is usually the same amount.
Royalties.
Royalties also would count, so would required minimum distributions from your IRA if you're over 73, but anything that comes in every month, that's what we're talking about when we say income. We're also needing to look at the gross amount, so not the net amount that hits your account. So Social Security, for example, has a gross amount. They're usually going to deduct your Medicare premium, and they may deduct some other things out of there. So we're looking at that top number, the gross amount, not the net amount that's coming into your bank account. That's important. So Texas gets to create the rules for how we use Medicaid here in the state. And they believe that a spouse at home needs $3,853.50 to survive on. So if I'm the spouse in the community, I'm always going to keep my income. So if my name is on the check, I'm always going to keep that income. I'm going to keep. Yep.
So if my check is $5,000 a month and I'm the spouse at home, what happens to my $5,000?
I keep my $5,000.
Right. That's important. People come in all the time and say, I'm going to lose my check. You were never going to lose your check.
Yeah, that's
Okay,
correct.
okay.
Yeah, unlikely that my Social Security is $5,000, but but I'm going to keep my Social Security check. I'm going to keep my pension, and I'm going to keep enough of my spouse's Social Security and pension to get me to that $3,853.
So let me stop you again. So if I'm like, let's just say traditional Texas marriage, and maybe the wife stayed at home, so she doesn't have the work history, she doesn't have the Social Security built up, so she has a very low income. I've seen many spouses only have $300, $400, $500 Social Security because they were the home, keeper while their spouse was working. So they'll keep their $300, $400, $500, but that's not enough to live off of.
Exactly.
So
right.
what happens?
So what's scary to people is if you go visit a skilled nursing facility or others that are there, often what will trickle back to you is that when someone goes to the skilled nursing facility, they'll take all of that person's income. And that's true if it's a single person minus the $75 for personal needs allowance and supplemental insurance deductions. But they will take all of their income. That's different with a spouse at home, and that's very important. That's what Chris or I can calculate for a couple, but that spouse at home is going to keep 100% of their income and get a spousal allowance of enough of that spouse's income so that their minimum needs are met with $3,853.50, and that number goes up every year. Yep. So we're going to calculate for you. You have this much in income. You're entitled to keep this much in spousal allowance. So the co-payment to the facility is probably still there, but it's that institutionalized spouse's income minus $75 for personal needs, minus their supplemental insurance deductions, minus the spousal allowance that gets to stay with the spouse at home. So let's say, for example, you have a couple that he has $2,000 in income and she has $1,500 in income. Well, she's going to keep her $1,500 and she's going to keep all $2,000 of his income as a spousal allowance. So the end result of that calculation is that there is no co-payment to the facility. It's a full vendor pay because she would be entitled to keep all of both of their incomes.
Medicaid would pay the facility. The spouse at home would keep 100% of the available income to continue living in the community.
Yep.
So those are the results we hope for, right? We want the spouse at home to be taken care of. The state of Texas wants the spouse at home to be taken care of. But you got to know the rules and you got to request it.
That's exactly right. You do have to request it. I was going to say that exactly. So that is a request that you need to make to Medicaid, and calculating that, hey, I do want to keep this spousal allowance amount.
Okay. So, Kristen, you told us how the spouse at home gets to keep always keeps their income, may get a portion of their spouse's income up to the limits. How else can income help a married couple?
Oh, so if you are calculating, Chris mentioned we're going to talk about income and about resources. So the calculation for a married couple is individualized. So like we've done podcasts before on if I'm a single person, there is a bright line 2000 rule, that single person, and we talk about what are countable versus non-countable or protected assets. But at the end of the day, your limit is $2,000. With a married couple, you don't have a bright line. So if I am a married couple and one spouse needs a facility, Chris or I or someone will have to calculate for you. This is what your protected resource amount is. It is individualized for you as a couple. It is not something that you could find on the internet by Googling. You will have to have someone calculate it for you.
Yep. If
you have income, gross total income that is lower than that $3,853.50, the calculation for the resources that you can keep expands. It's called an expanded spousal protected resource amount. So if you have lower than that income, you are allowed to keep more assets than other people might be allowed to. That's because the state considers that you as a spouse at home need that amount of monthly income, that $3,853.50, and if you don't have it, they want you to keep more money in the bank so you can supplement what your monthly needs are.
The way I look at it, and see if this helps anyone, is basically when it comes to counting assets and protecting assets, there's two ways to look at it. There's the traditional method, which we'll talk about in a minute, and there's this kind of a special way or a unique way that deals with folks who have what I would say lower income, lower combined incomes, but have assets. Anytime I'm talking to a family and they say, well, mom's only source of income is Social Security, dad's only source of income is Social Security, but they're not high Social Securities. They weren't in that sector making Social Security deposits all that long, but they own a lot of stuff. Then I know that's a case where I want to start saying, hey, is this one of those special cases Kristen was talking about where I can expand how much property can be protected without doing a traditional counting method? And you can really, I've seen couples with owning a lot of things, but because of their low income, they qualified under this alternative method of applying, and everything they owned was protected. I mean, it was great. It was really great in those situations, and there was no spin down. They were qualified as of day one.
Right. And I think that's what is unique and a really great, opportunity. You need to have this assessed for yourself, because a lot of people will not get the medical care, get the information that they need, because they're assuming they're going to spend down. They're assuming that they're going to have a copayment that will take all of their income.
Mom and dad have a home. Mom and dad have a farm. They've got 3 cars, so we know they're not going to qualify. And I'm like, oh no, they've been qualified since the first of last month.
They may already be eligible, and you had no idea.
Do not make assumptions on this. This is government counting, not us folk counting, right? They do it their own way. But okay, so we got this neat method, but really pretty complex. Not going into today. Just understand those opportunities exist. But let's just say that's not opportunity. Maybe they've got normal, higher income, so we know we can't take advantage of that difference between the number that's protected in their incomes. What do we do under a normal situation?
Sure. So what we would calculate as a traditional spousal protected resource amount, and again, this is one of those things where we want to kind of explain it, but not really encourage you to do it on your own. When people come in and visit with us, they're like, well, we've tried to Google this, and you just cannot figure it out. And that is true. You cannot figure this out on your own, how to apply those spousal protected resource amounts. You are welcome to come in and have us do it for you, but please be careful when you apply these rules yourself. So if my husband went into the facility today, I have a snapshot date of the first date of this month. So January 1st, 2024 would be our snapshot date. Medicaid is going to require that we send in all bank statements, all investment statements, all cash value life insurance, every asset that we have. We will have to send into them a written statement showing the balance on January 1st. They will count our countable assets, or someone should do this for you as opposed to Medicaid, but we will count your countable assets and determine what they were on January 1st.
So let me stop you real quick. So what Kristen is saying is that everything you own gets listed, basically, and it has a value assigned to it. But just because you own it doesn't mean it's going to be held against you when it comes to government counting, right? You list it all. The government sees it all. Hey, they have X, Y, and Z, but maybe the X doesn't count. So why would some assets count and some don't?
Sure. So again, Medicaid is a federal program, but Texas creates the rules. So there's lists, again, not that you will find on the internet, but there are lists of things that people who do this routinely understand of assets that count and those that don't. Some big assets that do not count towards that total would be your home and the contiguous acreage, as long as it is valued at less than $713,000, which the value you'd pull from the tax rolls. Your qualified accounts, if you are over the age of 73, don't count. So if my spouse is age 75, he's not, but if he were age 75, his IRA, whatever the total, would not count towards our eligibility. Now,
$1 million in his IRA, traditional IRA, and he is 75. You're telling me that $1 million is not a countable asset when it comes to resources?
That's exactly what I'm telling you. Under Texas Medicaid rules and regulations, that is not an asset that they count. They consider it exempt. Now, they do count the required minimum distribution as part of your income, and so that gets calculated in some way. But Texas is making some rules on what they consider protected assets. And you see your home and your retirement accounts protected under other rules, like creditor rules, they're exempt from. So there's reasons for that. They consider those to be assets that should be protected from various things, and this is one of them. So things that do count: cash in the bank, CDs, investment accounts, money market accounts, cash value on life insurance. Any of those are going to be countable assets that I'm going to add up January 1st and find a total.
On the life insurance, I've had people come in and say, Chris, this pays $60,000 when my loved one dies. That is not what we're talking about. You need the cash surrender value. You have to call the owner of the policy or whoever's insuring y'all and get it in writing. Ask them nicely to tell you the value on the phone so we can use it.
Yes.
but it's a completely different number. So the cash surrender value may be zero for a term life policy, and it may be something much greater for a whole life or some kind of hybrid policy. Okay, so you're talking about counting things. I had that midlife crisis, and I bought a Corvette.
Car of any value doesn't count. One
Right?
car
One
of any
car.
value.
Yeah. So it's unusual. There's assumptions that people make, and they're assuming wrong.
That's absolutely true. Absolutely true. So let's say, hypothetically, my countable assets on January 1st are $200,000. How do I make my spouse eligible for Medicaid? Under the traditional rules, assuming that I have combined gross income of more than $4,000, so I'm over that $3,853.50 limit, what will happen is Medicaid will allow my spouse to become eligible for Medicaid when I spend below half of those assets. So if on January 1st I have $200,000 in countable assets, remembering that not all things are countable, my individualized resource limit would be $100,000. So to make my spouse eligible for Medicaid, I'd have to go from $200,000 to $100,000 in countable assets. Now, what Medicaid is expecting you to do is to privately pay until you've spent down that $100,000. That's how the rules were originally created. That's what they're kind of expecting you to do. Now, the job of someone like Chris or myself is to help you understand what other options within the rules are available to you to preserve as much of that $100,000, that spend down amount that you can. And while we're not going to get into all of the options here, because again, that is something you should not and cannot apply on your own without professional advice, we want you to know that there is really always a way to preserve that $100,000. We work with couples, I would say, on a daily or weekly basis to work within these rules to save and preserve even the spend down amount that you're having to spend down, where you're actually retaining all of those assets.
Among the clients that come in, married couples are the ones which have the most flexibility or options.
Absolutely.
I know they're the ones with the highest emotions, they're the ones who are the most concerned, but they're usually the ones when I'm looking at the situation feeling the most relieved about. Generally speaking, when you are a married couple, the spouse at home will be okay.
Yes. There are, I want to point out, there are some minimum and maximums set on that countable asset 1/2 limit. So if my assets were $50,000, I have to get below half, but there's a minimum, and this year it is $30,828. So even though half of 50 would be 25, my limit is actually 30,828 because that's the minimum set. So if I were a married couple and my countable assets were below 30,828, that's another instance where we're eligible immediately and I don't have to spend down in any way.
I've had many couples own many things, but when it came to countable things,
Right.
they were below the limit and they were qualified.
Because again, remember, I can have $1 million IRA,
Not count.
but if I have $25,000 cash in the bank,
We've seen spouses whose stress levels here, but once they understand the actual rules and how they're applied to their own lives, it's work, but it will be successful. Their loved one will be cared for, and they will not be destitute. Their assets are safe.
never left with bad news.
Yeah.
One other thing that people hear, not as much anymore, but have heard, is that they have to get divorced to protect their assets, and that is not true.
Yeah, I love married couples for this fact. The state of Texas loves married couples, and it gives us great protections.
The news is always good. That's right. I've never had a sad spouse leave my office. They've always been relieved. They're going to keep the house. They're going to keep their income. They're going to keep their assets. Absolutely.
They have great flexibility.
Yes. The maximum amount that we've not mentioned yet. So let's say my countable resources are $400,000 on my snapshot date. And so 1/2 would be $200,000. Well, Medicaid does set a maximum, and this year it's $154,140. So even if I have $400,000, I would have to spend below $154,000 to become eligible. So instead of spending $200,000, I'm spending $250,000 essentially. So it is an individualized calculation, even if there are some parameters on it. But you do need to have that calculated for yourself so you know what number you need to get to become eligible. There is, Chris, some very important follow-up work. So we're really only talking about Medicaid eligibility. So you get below that limit for a first of the month, that's what you apply for. So if you can do all that work this month, apply for February 1st. If you can do all that work next month, apply for March 1st. The date is yours to calculate. You can do it whenever you want, but you are privately paying during the interim. So time is a little bit of the essence. And while it is not the topic of the video, I do want to mention with Medicaid, eligibility dates and understanding that is very important. But then also protecting assets from Medicaid estate recovery is very important. We talk a little bit just about the follow-up. So let's say we've made someone eligible for Medicaid. What are the next very important things they need to do?
Yeah. So whenever we're dealing with a married couple, we want to qualify as a spouse in the facility so they're cared for. Then we want to look at what would happen if the spouse at home was to pass away first, right? We want to protect the spouse in the facility, so we want to try to, as part of our spin down plan, we would transfer assets to the spouse in the community, but then we want to make sure the spouse in the community, the spouse still at home, we want to try as much as we can to keep those assets from pouring back to the spouse in the facility in case there's an untimely death of the spouse at home, right? We want to protect the person in the facility to the day they pass away. And then when that spouse at home, spouse in the facility does pass away, we want to do our best to avoid having the government reimbursed. I mean, you have your hand in the cookie jar. We're getting government benefits, and they expect to get paid back unless you're able to, in this case, avoid probate. In Texas, they've laid out the rules that if you can have your assets pass outside of probate, then the government will not basically claw back for reimbursements.
Right. Yeah. So important second step is transferring all countable assets to the spouse that is in the community, and then updating that spouse's plan to go either to a trust that wouldn't count for the spouse in the institution or directly to the kids if you have good kids that would be trustworthy with that. But often that means we're gifting the home and doing a ladybird deed or transitioning other countable assets. So there is some additional work. So
updating beneficiaries,
yes.
all the stuff that nobody likes to do and is frequently forgotten.
Yes, but it is a second step. It's not important to eligibility, so please don't get bogged down in doing that now. That is after you've applied and become eligible, then there is an important thing to do in the next year where you're transitioning assets to the other spouse and updating their plan so that you've provided for, if either passes, that you've protected those assets as well.
Clients work so hard to get their loved one eligible, and then they hear us, they see the list, they talk about it, and then they just forget to finish it up. We want to make sure those assets pass to the family, preferably not back to the person in the facility unless it's through one of those specialized trusts, because it's just not going to be beneficial, and the government will happily take all that stuff back.
Right. So the message, I suppose, is if you have a spouse or a parent sometimes that needs long-term care, skilled nursing, there is certainly help available through Medicaid. Medicaid does have two programs. One is at skilled nursing, where if you meet the rules we've just outlined, you can apply and be eligible as soon as you are eligible, income and resource-wise. At home, there is a program as well called Star Plus Waiver that can provide some in-home sitter services, but there is a wait list. So that is a number that you would call and put your parent or spouse on the wait list, wait for your number to come up, and then apply using all the same rules.
Star Plus Waiver has a few bumps, so be very careful if you're dealing with that. Make sure you talk to us before you do anything different there. There's mostly the same, but there's a few hiccups. Please don't engage in self-help.
Yes, but the good news is if you have a spouse or a parent that needs skilled nursing care or Medicaid, there are ways to protect your assets and income for the spouse that's staying in the community, and we are glad to help, glad to give you an individualized review. We've got our website in the notes below, so if you need to have an appointment, please call, set up something with us, and we'll send you a checklist of items you need to kind of gather, which is income, bank statements, assets, so that we can give you that individualized review and tell you what the rules look like for you.
Yep.
Anything else you want to add?
Nope.
Thanks for
y'all.
joining us, Gun. Bye.